The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar on combating institutional racism and social injustice. This free webinar is part of our Subscriber Advantage program available exclusively for our customers enrolled in our subscription services. For this topic, we have also invited new customers who are not currently enrolled in a subscription. I'm Leon Frierson, the Publications Coordinator for Personnel Concepts, and I'm joined by my co-moderator, Rosie Milan, who serves as our Senior Regulatory Researcher.
Hi to all of our attendees. I'd like to welcome Jade Alexander Craig Esquire as our guest speaker. Jade is an attorney at the law firm of Gordon Reese in Tampa, Florida. Jade graduated from the University of Virginia and Columbia Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Columbia Journal of Race and Law. He also served on the staff of 2 federal judges at the trial and appellate court levels and was appointed by the Obama administration to serve as the policy advisor to the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD. Jade specializes in commercial litigation, labor and employment, and intellectual property law. Thank you, Joy, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to discussing today's topic. Far too often, organizations and even our country view the challenge of institutional racism from an internal standpoint. Some of the common responses to racially charged events include training for employees around cultural sensitivity and recognizing internal bias, sending an email about the company's commitment to diversity, and hosting conversations with employees about race. After the period of unrest passes, the company goes back to literally business as usual. And now is the opportunity to do more.
Yes, definitely. We're looking forward to discussing this with you. So today's agenda focuses on providing an overview of racism and social injustice and how employers can make changes that help them be a vital part of moving toward a solution. We will begin with a brief overview of anti-discrimination laws. Then we'll look at the broader problem of institutional racism. Jade will then discuss the current drawbacks of talking about race. Next, we will examine the personal impact that employees may be experiencing and what employers can do to help. And finally, Jade will go over tips on what employers can do to combat racism and social injustice within their organization. At the end, we'll address questions submitted by our listeners.
And the format for today's webinar features a series of questions that we'll be asking to Jade regarding institutional racism and social injustice. Before we begin, I want to invite everyone in attendance to submit any questions you may have during the presentation by using the Ask Question feature in GoToWebinar. You can also post questions in the question window. Most questions will be saved for the end of today's session, when you will have an opportunity to use the raise hand feature in GoToWebinar to pose a question directly to our guest speaker. Now, we recognize that racism and social injustice is a sensitive and controversial topic for many Americans, and some of you in attendance may have differing views. All of our presenters today will make an effort to avoid using any insensitive or controversial language. We also respectfully ask that you use similar discretion if you're given an opportunity to pose a question to our guest speaker. With that, let's get started with today's presentation. Rosie?
Okay, Jade, I know you have a lot of ideas and tips to share with us today about combating institutional racism, but we thought we'd start with a quick overview of the laws that address race discrimination in the workplace. Can you review the major federal and state anti-discrimination laws that apply?
Certainly, Rosie. At the federal level, the predominant anti-discrimination law pertaining to the workplace is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits harassment and discrimination in employment against individuals based on race, color, national origin, religion, and sex. This federal law applies to businesses with 15 or more employees, so smaller businesses are usually covered by state laws that are at least as stringent as Title VII. According to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which is the agency that enforces Title VII, close to a third of all discrimination charges under Title VII involve race discrimination.
And are there any laws that apply to discrimination against customers based on race and color?
There are, Leon. First, Title II which is another section of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, protects customers and visitors in places of public accommodation from discrimination based on their race. So this applies to places like retail stores, hotels, restaurants, and other establishments open to the public. If you operate one of these establishments, it is illegal to deny services based on race or to enact policies that discriminate against minority customers. Another important statute that applies to both employment and customer relationships is Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1991. Section 1981 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race when making and enforcing contracts. Section 1981 specifically grants all individuals within the jurisdiction of the United States the same rights and benefits. In the words of the statute, quote, as is enjoyed by white citizens, unquote. Section 1981 was originally part of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and was passed to assist free slaves in having the same rights or integrating into American society after the Civil War. Section 1981 applies today to contractual relationships as simple as the purchase of goods and services. Courts have also interpreted Section 1981 to apply to the employment context, including at-will employment and the independent contractor relationship. Oftentimes, in discrimination lawsuits, plaintiffs will bring a Title VII claim along with a Section 1981 claim if their Title VII claim is based on race. And lastly, many states have their own anti-discrimination and public accommodations laws. These state anti-discrimination laws often apply to businesses with less than 15 employees who may not be covered by Title VII, and as discussed, may be more stringent than Title VII. Each state anti-discrimination law has its own specific provisions, and some states have no anti-discrimination law at all, unfortunately. So it's important to check your state's specific employment laws for more information.
Okay, and then before we move on to the next section, Jade, we are getting some feedback from our audience that they're having a little bit of difficulty hearing you. So if you could adjust or maybe turn yourself up, come closer to the mic, that I think that may be helpful for the presentation. Also, I do want to communicate to the audience that we will be sending the presentation out afterwards as well. So make sure to be checking your emails. We will be having a full PowerPoint and also the audio of this presentation that will go out to you. So moving along here, Jade, do you have any tips for employers on what they can do to prevent and respond to race discrimination claims?
Yes, Leon. There are several things that businesses should do to be legally compliant, prevent race discrimination in the workplace, and appropriately respond if a complaint is made. So first, businesses should establish an environment of stability and respect. Workplaces that allow uncivil behavior and disrespectful communication are more likely to experience all types of discrimination claims. Second, employers should investigate complaints promptly and thoroughly. A failure to do so can be used against you if the complainant or others in similar situations experience a harmful conduct while waiting for you to investigate or take corrective action. Third, companies should deliver anti-discrimination and harassment training annually. Employers should make sure everyone knows what is not acceptable in their applicable laws addressing race discrimination in the workplace and what to do if they experience, witness, or suspect any harassment or discrimination in the workplace. Finally, employers should analyze their policies, procedures, and practices and modify them accordingly. It's important to consider whether your policies and practices are negatively impacting a minority group or a protected class of individuals. But legal compliance is not enough. Businesses need to go beyond the law and evaluate workplace culture, values, branding, and dynamics. Checking the boxes can protect you legally, but the minimum necessary does not effectively address the underlying problem of institutional racism.
Okay, thank you, Jade. And most employers have probably taken steps to comply with anti-discrimination laws, such as those enforced by federal and state agencies. But I think as a nation, we're recognizing the need to go beyond surface compliance. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, Rosie. The subject of this webinar, in the scope of the webinar, goes far beyond anti-discrimination laws in the workplace. As a lawyer, I have found that the law in the traditional sense, like court cases and statutes, does not answer all the questions on institutional racism or solve every problem. Lawyers have to be wary of the adage, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In fact, the law is surprisingly flexible when it comes to anti-racism efforts in the workplace. Civil rights laws are designed to prevent discrimination rather than inhibit equality. But we have developed the law to be better at telling us what not to do, but not as good at directing us as to what we should do. The law at its best is an instrumental tool, either for repression and exclusion, as it has been used in the past, or for social change. As a law student, one of my professors used to say, law is the relationship between the is, the ought, and the what might be. Today, we'll explore all three facets, the trinity of that relationship.
Okay, thank you for that, Jade. And we do have our first poll question for our listeners. And we would like to remind everybody that responses are anonymous. So which best describes how comfortable you feel discussing race discrimination in the workplace? Are you comfortable with it? Somewhat comfortable? You're open to it, but wary of employee sensitivity? You're uncomfortable or very uncomfortable with the subjects? Okay, and it looks like votes are still piling in, so we'll give everybody a moment to answer that. Okay, votes are still coming in. Okay. Votes are still coming in. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and close that and share our results. Okay, so it seems like at the very top is comfortable with it. Many of you are open to it, but wary of it, wary of employee sensitivity.
All right, thank you, audience, for your honest and candid answers. Jay, just moving along, could you start out by discussing the broader issue of institutional racism and social injustice?
Of course, LeJohn. Institutional racism is about power. Social injustice is a result of institutional racism. Dr. William Glasser, an American psychologist, debuted choice theory psychology in his 1998 book, Choice Theory, A New Psychology of Personal Freedom. According to Dr. Glasser, humans are instinctually driven by 5 basic needs: survival, love and belonging, fun, freedom, and power. The power need is the most misunderstood. The word power reminds many of us of domination and control, but Glasser was referring to a personal power, the need for accomplishment, choice, and agency over our own lives. One of the most famous sermons of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is called The Drum Major Instinct. The title refers to this drive for a sense of importance and recognition. In the words of Dr. King, what he calls the race problem grows out of a need that some people have to feel superior, a need that some people have to feel that they are first, and to feel that their white skin ordained them to be first. To understand the history of institutional racism and social injustice, I'd like to use popular games as an analogy. Power and institutional racism operate much like the game of chess. The object of chess is to protect the king. The king is placed in check when another piece on the board threatens to capture him. When the king is placed in check, the only permissible move in the game is one that involves getting the king out of the line of danger. When the other pieces on the board put the king in a position where he has nowhere to move to avoid capture, that position is called checkmate, and the game is over. No matter if the game has gone on for only 5 moves or 5,000 moves, the game is over. Every aspect of social and political life in America is designed to protect the power of white supremacy. The first Europeans to arrive on these shores controlled their lives in their new land and their rules and customs were designed for their mutual benefit. As a result, as a group, they were the king on the board. Yet they alone had little control over protecting that system. Much like the king in chess, his mobility is very limited. He can only move one space in each direction around him. In the same way, the limitations that Europeans faced in a new foreign land required that they create systems to protect them and their interests. One might group systems that protect white supremacy, the king in chess, into four sets that make up the leading pieces of chess, similar to an allegory. Slavery and the systems of exploitation that flowed from it are the queen, who can move only laterally in all directions on the board. Social and political exclusion is the bishop, who can move only diagonally. The law is the rook, who moves only horizontally and vertically. And violence is the knight, who moves in an L shape outside that direct line of sight. They all have their limited ranges of movement, but they succeed in protecting the king when one backs up the other. The bishop stands behind the queen to discourage her capture. The knight will step in if the rook is in danger. In the same way, violence backs up the law when the law is in danger or is ineffective at protecting white supremacy. And political exclusion supports a system of exploitation. The opposing players, the people of color, are largely attacking these forces in an effort to get at the king. And these protectors operate in infinite ways to make the process intractable. So the history of America could be described as a 400-year-old game of chess. Another helpful visual image is that of a Russian matryoshka doll, sometimes called a nesting doll. The toy is a set of wooden dolls of decreasing size placed one inside the other. They all work together because they have the same dimensions, even though they're generally painted very differently in their outfits and faces. They all protect the doll behind it from exposure. America is a massive nesting doll. The very tiny doll in the center is power. White supremacy protects power. Slavery and the subjugation of blacks protects white supremacy. The law protects those three. The police and the courts protect these four. Writ large, exclusion, political, social, and economic, protect everything underneath. Institutional racism grows through exclusion. The process of opening up the doll is extremely difficult because of the size of those outer layers. With this framework in mind, it becomes clear that focusing on reform efforts solely within one's organization and its employees comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of the problems that many employees of color face as they navigate and remain trapped in these games.
Okay, thank you, Jade. And we have another poll for our audience. How would you rate your current level of understanding about the problem of institutional racism? Are you very well versed through studies or life experiences? Are you well versed? I understand the problem and can name examples. Somewhat well versed, I would like to learn more, or not well versed, I have not studied or thought about it. And we want to remind everybody that your responses are anonymous. And so we'll give everyone a moment to answer that. Okay, votes are still coming in. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that and share our results. Okay, so it looks like most of you are somewhat well-versed, but you would like to learn more. So that's very promising. Thank you, audience, for participating in that.
Yes, and I want to remind the audience that I do see some responses in the questions window. You can respond directly on the screen whenever there is a poll. So make sure that you do just click the answer that is applicable to you and your organization. And then also thank you guys for your responses regarding Jade's audio. It sounds like everything's good, Jade, so no worries there. So let's just move on. And also, I'm sorry, I do want to remind everyone to continue to submit questions that are specific to the presentation so that we can have an excellent Q&A. We're very excited about that question and answer session with Jade. So submit any questions that are applicable to the presentation you see here. Now, moving forward, Jade, would you say that the recent movement of people wanting to talk about and learn about other races is a step in the correct direction?
Well, Leon, I'd say that talking about race is important and it's a good start, but the mistake that organizations often make is that they look inward instead of outward. Talking about race also has its limitations. Talking about race often becomes a euphemism for educating white people about race. Scholars have described the role that people of color play in these settings as a quote-unquote black tax. The person of color has generally had to consider the issues deeply over the course of their life, while many white participants are engaging these issues for the first time. As a result, the process generally lends itself to the person of color carrying the burden of educating the group. That experience can be re-traumatizing for some because the ignorance of their white counterparts itself is a hard reminder of the difference in their respective social positions. Talking about race often creates a sense of complacency among the white participants. The engagement usually ends with the talk and no action or follow-up. So many white participants sometimes get the idea that the talk or becoming educated about race was the end goal of the process, when really it's just the beginning. Finally, the process often leaves everyone dissatisfied. We all know on some level that merely talking about race doesn't fix the problem of institutional racism or, to some extent, racial discrimination. The person of color sometimes feels that exhaustion I just described. At the same time, the white person may be left with the feeling that she doesn't know how to help or get involved, even though she may really want to. And neither party sees the situation change after the conversations or as a result. To overcome these limits, we need businesses to start new conversations by bringing the outside in. It's important to remove the burden from employees of having to educate each other about race. The inclusion of voices unheard sends a powerful message about how much that voice is valued within the organization. As part of this shift toward looking outward, organizations show employees their values by how they treat others, not just by how they treat their own. One possibility is to use art. Art can be a powerful medium for educating or for education that engages people in a visceral way that conversations just often can't do. So organizations should consider hosting or attending a play or a spoken word event with artists of color, or viewing a film or a documentary. I think these kinds of projects may be more effective than an event, for example, that relies on visual art, because visual art doesn't come with its own voice that people can hear. So employees still have to go through the process of educating each other about what the work should convey or mean. Art also has a way of fueling conversation and debate. It can lead to discussions that arise organically and serve as a less intimidating entree into the theme of race. I would also suggest bringing in an outside perspective to discuss a personal experience. Speakers, individuals with relevant lived experience, can bring a perspective that others in the organization may not have, and a voice they might not otherwise hear. The voices may range from an elderly Black woman who grew up in the Jim Crow South, a civil rights veteran, or a Black man wrongfully imprisoned due to racial profiling. Like art, people connect and understand each other through stories. A speaker may lead a discussion afterward or answer questions, which can have the same benefit as a conversation, but it doesn't require the employees to lead or facilitate it. All of these methods take the burden away from the group itself and places it on the third party. It also directs the employee's focus to that third party and away from themselves. And I think that can be useful in dealing with some of the self-consciousness and discomfort that many white Americans describe feeling and struggling with in conversations about race. And on the other side, the pressure that many people of color feel in the same setting.
Okay, thank you, Jade. We have another poll for our audience. So recent events regarding racism have taken a hold of the country. How has your business been impacted? You're experiencing conflict between employees on the issue, seen an increase in race-related employee complaints, minimal impact due to prior efforts on diversity and/or/slash equality, or our business has not been directly affected as of yet. And you can go ahead and select all that apply on this one. Okay, and votes are still coming in, so we'll leave this open for another moment. Votes are still coming in. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close this. Okay, and it looks like overwhelmingly responses. Your business has not been directly affected as of yet. That's good.
All right, and thank you all for sharing that information. Thank you, Jade, as well. But what about addressing employees' experiences of color and social injustice? Is there a way that a business can provide support without violating employment laws? I feel like many employers want to help, but maybe they just don't know how.
That's a great question, Leon. Racism and social injustice have a personal impact that affects the performance of employees of color in the workplace. Employers should provide support for that trauma while still remaining in compliance with the law. One way they can do that is through providing additional paid leave days. Employers should consider giving employees explicit permission to take time to care for themselves and their loved ones and find ways to cope with direct and vicarious trauma. This kind of permission may be necessary to reach employees of color. In fact, research shows that Black and Hispanic employees take advantage of paid leave offered by their employers less than their white counterparts, even after controlling for demographic factors and job types. Organizations should also make sure their affected employees understand the various types of leave that are available to them to help them cope with the mental effects of racism and social justice, including a sick leave, bereavement leave, or vacation leave, for example. Another way that employers can provide support is by offering an employee assistance program, sometimes called an EAP program. EAP programs can go a long way toward addressing the immediate need for mental health services. Employers should, however, assess how culturally informed those EAP therapists are, either on their own or through their EAP management or service providers. Studies show that people of color in America are historically less likely to receive mental health services than whites, and those that do participate or in therapy after starting treatment will do so in a fewer number of sessions. Ensuring the quality of those services beyond simply providing them is essential to supporting the trauma those employees of color are facing.
Okay, thank you, Jade. These are important steps that employers can take to help immediately, but could you talk to us about changing the organization as a whole, going beyond what is perhaps reactive and instilling a more proactive culture?
Yes. So at the beginning of the conversation, we discussed how racism is about power. Given that the problem of institutional racism is power, the solution to institutional racism requires a redistribution of power. The redistribution of power starts with recognizing and accepting that everyone has that same personal need for power. In fact, it's not necessarily surprising that white supremacy developed in America because it came to fulfill, at least in part, the power need for an entire group of people. So in some ways, it was a very efficient way of fulfilling that need. Nonetheless, it is critical that we create systems and institutions in which everyone, including people of color, can fulfill that need. The values that drive this process are trust, investment, and risk. So let's look at some of the ways that organizations can start to instill these values. Organizations should take steps to bring people of color into the leadership of the organization. Positions of leadership give people the ability to allocate resources that give them and others the ability to direct and control the context of their life, the organization in which they work, the types of people who work inside of that organization, what its priorities are and what it produces, and the impact that it has on the broader world. Leadership goes beyond letting people of color into the door. Giving a person of color a position of leadership communicates trust, a respect for that person's abilities, and a belief that they will have your best interests at heart. It is also an investment in which you give them something that you do not otherwise have to give, something that is important and valuable to you. Businesses should also recruit people of color to work in the organization and work to keep them there. Increasing the number of people of color in positions of leadership generally requires bringing them into the organization at the beginning stages of their career. The work, however, extends beyond hiring. The presence of people of color in lower level positions that involve more turnover requires an intentional approach by employers to address their hiring and termination process overall, including keeping track of layoff lists and taking stock of employee performance more than employee positions when making termination decisions. This process can avoid falling into the default, where people of color are the last hired because of the lower level positions they disproportionately occupy and the first fired for the same reason. Organizations should consider providing opportunities for education and training. Employers should be intentional about providing additional training opportunities for all employees, and particularly employees of color. Cross-training and upskilling workers can facilitate the process of keeping high-performing employees even when you decide that you need to eliminate certain positions based on business needs or priorities. For example, in a grocery store, employees who work as cashiers can also be trained to work at the customer service counter or in handling inventory. In a factory, an employee who handles only assembly might also learn how to do quality control and equipment maintenance. As a lawyer, for a personal example, I've worked in intellectual property, commercial litigation, and labor and employment law. So when one practice area dries up, I can move into another one just as easily. In fact, I've been advised to consider bankruptcy law because when the economy is down, bankruptcy goes up. But I just don't have the time to fit it in. So when an organization needs shift or change, employees have the skills to move into another area if this kind of cross-training and upskilling takes place. Enabling employees to become versatile can empower those employees who may be the most vulnerable in the organization. From the standpoint of redistributing power, recruiting employees of color gives them resources that allow them to shape the direction of their own career, to have resources that they can use to chart their own course. Likewise, employers should support and value employees who obtain additional academic growth, including, for example, rewarding employees who participate in degree, certification, or vocational programs, and offering student loan-related bonuses or stipends. Indeed, even a small amount can still have an impact. The investment is effective simply because the act itself shows that you have considered the issue and you're willing to put some amount of your resources behind it to support what you say. In this area, it is truly the thought that counts. Organizations should also find ways to give employees ownership in the business or what they produce or provide. Employers should consider bonus structures and forms of financial ownership that increase compensation and allow employees to invest in the company in a way that gives them options. For example, employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, can increase morale among employees, according to research, and their investment in the organization, their workplace. Studies have also shown that ESOPs can have an impact on closing the wealth gap between Americans of color and their white counterparts. Other financial investment opportunities can have similar results. Again, like the incentive around training, allowing a small investment has the same kind of benefit. So these approaches are not just limited to big companies.
Thanks again, Jay. Now, you also mentioned the element of risk as an important factor in helping to enact positive change. Can you expand on that?
Sure, Leon. So institutional change involves risk. The Oxford Dictionary defines risk as exposing someone or something valued to danger, harm, or loss. As a college student, I had the opportunity to complete an internship at a Center for Peace and Reconciliation in Ireland. The center held a weekend conference led by a white South African woman who was a university professor that had lived through apartheid. She explained, people don't fear change, they fear loss. Risk requires vulnerability, something that is exposed, something that one values, like their financial security, the success of their organization, or their profit, despite the perceived fear of that change. In essence, we are all taking a chance on each other. Think of what is most important to you and your business, and then figure out a way to give some of that away. So employers can figure out how to share their resources and the goods and services that their business provides with the community. This process involves giving from what is most important to your organization to the community. For example, businesses develop their value and profit from the time and labor of their employees. Give employees paid time each week or month to volunteer at an organization, a cause of their choice, or a shared cause chosen by the organization that involves working with a low-income community of color. Employers should provide these employees a way to talk about and share that experience, a process that can engage individuals at multiple levels in their own journey toward anti-racist perspectives and choices. Again, to return to the notion of looking outward, this kind of conversation lends itself to employees talking about their volunteer work, something about which many of them may become really passionate, and what they've learned, rather than having to talk about their own personal narrative. It also engages the fact that racism is not just a personal experience. Institutional racism, the broader problem, is a social experience that can only be dealt with socially. In the same way, a business relies on the goods it sells or the services it provides to make its profit. Consider what you sell and give some of that away. It is not a question of money. Money is a resource that an organization can give that is familiar. A business can give an amount that doesn't hurt their bottom line, and they can always make more money. Time, however, is arguably more valuable than money because it is not something you can make more of. Likewise, a good that you produce or a service that you provide is a zero-sum game. Something that you give away to one person is something that you cannot sell to another person. It inherently involves a loss. The business's space and operations are also a resource. Employers should find ways to invite the community in by creating opportunities with internships, apprenticeships, and job training. Helping individuals develop skills is the equivalent of giving a man a fish versus teaching him how to fish. Giving fish is important and extremely useful. Nonetheless, teaching a person of color how to fish, in effect, also enhances her capacity. Her skill is a resource she can use in an infinite number of ways, long after the fish is gone. This kind of investment has an impact on employees of color in the way they relate to the organization. Just as the process of making space for outside voices has an impact internally, a company also shows its value by how it shares its resources externally. Oddly enough, and it sounds somewhat contradictory, employees see what you're doing outside in the community, and they sometimes can increase their commitment and sense of confidence inside the organization.
Okay, thank you, Jade. And we have our last poll question for our audience. Based on what we discussed today, what steps would you consider implementing in your business to address racial equality? Please go ahead and select all that apply. Take steps to bring people of color into leadership, recruit more people of color and work to retain them, provide more opportunities for education and training, find ways to give employees ownership in what they do, share goods and services with the community. You can go ahead and select more than one. Okay, and votes are still coming in, so we'll give a few more moments. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that poll and share our results. Okay, so this is all over the board, which is good. Thank you, audience.
All right, and Jay, the information you shared with us is not only insightful, but also very inspiring. I'm personally invested in this topic, so thank you so much for all that you've taught me today. But finally, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
Certainly, Leon, I do. To my surprise, I have found that Isaac Newton's laws of motion are inspiring in this fight against institutional racism. While we know the first law of motion generally is the law of inertia, the actual words taken from his text, written in 1686, are even more illuminating in this moment. The text reads, "Every object persists in its state of rest or uniform motion in a straight line unless it is compelled to change that state by forces impressed upon it." W.E.B. Du Bois, sometimes referred to by many as the father of American sociology, wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The color line remains in this century and will continue to do so until a line is drawn in front of it to prevent its forward march. Until, in the words of Sir Isaac Newton, it is compelled to change that state by forces impressed upon it. Racism remains in motion by the forces described that push it, including the exclusion of leaders, voices, and owners in all of our institutions. Likewise, it remains at rest by silence, ignorance, blindness, and inaction. Newton's third law of motion explains both the difficulty we have with changing our institutions and the power that we have when we do the work to change them. Newton wrote, "For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The struggle for equality and freedom in America has generally been met with backlash. Pushback is a natural response to change that is to be expected. It's even part of Newton's third law of motion. But it is critical that we remain vigilant about responding to the push of each force that operates against forward motion. And the only way to protect that forward motion, our progress, is to push back against the forces that oppose it. Businesses and organizations are institutions. Focusing on the outside changes the institution on the inside."
All right, and thank you, Jay, for reviewing that information with us. And before we end today's session, we'll go ahead and get into the Q&A. We'll take a moment to answer some questions from our audience that were submitted during the presentation. And I'll start off by saying that we got a lot of people in agreement with everything you presented today, and giving you kudos for what was presented in the webinar today. So that's already great feedback. In fact, some of their questions were answered shortly after they posed them. But I will start off with a question about leave, because you mentioned that oftentimes people of color don't take the leave that is presented to them. So Rhonda asked, how come they don't take advantage? But then Mr. Smallwood in the audience had a more specific question. He asks, in terms of additional paid leave, would leave only for people of color or additional leave for all employees in general? If the leave would only be for employees of color, would that be considered as excluding other types of employees? So would it be discriminatory if you were to offer a specialized leave for people of color?
I do believe it would be discriminatory if an employer offered a specialized leave for people of color. Title VII protects individuals on the basis of race or color, national origin, from discrimination in the benefits or privileges of employment, similar to Section 1981. And providing leave to one group as opposed to another is basically tantamount to that kind of exclusion. And so I would say that all of the ideas that I've been discussing or presenting fall under the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. These are ideas that should be implemented broadly throughout the organization and made available to everyone. But there is a specific benefit that they can have on employees of color that's valuable. To your question, Leon, about why many employees don't take the lead, researchers who find this result theorize that Black and Hispanic employees feel like they're under a microscope or pressure to perform well, to perform better than their white counterparts, and that and the fear is that if they take the lead, they will seem lazy, that they will fall behind in their work, and this contributes to stereotypes that they're trying to operate or work against. So, you know, for example, when I was growing up, and I know a lot of African Americans have this experience, you're taught to be twice as good to get half as far. And taking some kind of leave puts you at a disadvantage. And I think that's the general perception.
Yes, thank you. And I have a little bit of a commentary or criticism here. It's Paul in the audience says he's a person of color, and he asks, why is this presentation biased against white people? So I want to kind of redirect the question a little bit and see if you can recommend some tips for businesses to show political and social support for ending institutional racism without abandoning their white customers and employees.
I do think that this project or conversation isn't meant to be discriminatory against white people or white Americans at all. I think that the history in America does involve, and it's a matter of historical record, that whites have been given privileges and benefits above people of color in this country, and they've been given many of these advantages, including positions of leadership and authority in America that come from the exclusion of others, of people of color, through the law, violence, and social exclusion. And my interest is in figuring out what we can do now rather than sort of focusing on this history. And I do think all of these strategies are ways that white employees can also benefit from the process. When I discuss talking about race, one of the reasons I sort of discourage it is that it does leave white employees often with this feeling that they're being attacked, confronted, or blamed, when the blame really isn't on them. The problem isn't with the individual white person. The problem is with the system in which we all live. I think about Norman Rockwell's painting of Ruby Bridges, the little girl who attempted to integrate the school system in New Orleans during the Civil Rights Movement. He called the painting The Problem We All Live With. And it was of Ruby Bridges walking, followed by federal marshals with the N-word behind her on the wall. Racism is the problem we all live with. So all of these strategies are ways to get everybody involved in the process. White Americans can benefit from hearing the voice of a person of color, from getting involved in a community service activity in a low-income community of color, mentoring a young person who does an internship in their organization, and giving away a service that they provide. So, for example, a law firm might do pro bono legal services in an interest of affecting this kind of change. And a white lawyer who participates in that program will also see the benefit and joy that comes from providing advocacy for a person who otherwise might not have a voice. So this is a way for everybody to get involved.
Thank you. That was an excellent answer. And kind of just continuing on in that vein, I have a question from Michaela here. in a predominantly white small community in New England, how do you recruit people of color without thinking the community members are thinking you're doing it to make a statement instead of intentionally being inclusive? And then furthermore, she says, what are some ways to recruit people of color in such a community? If you have any tips on how to improve the recruitment process.
Well, I first would start with, working within that community. There often are organizations that advocate for people of color or affinity groups, whether it's a local chapter of the NAACP or the Urban League, a historically Black fraternity or sorority, or groups for people of color on college campuses. And it could be useful, for example, to do a presentation or agree to sponsor an event with one of these organizations as part of starting that conversation or dialogue. I think that offering internship opportunities to students in these organizations, just as you would, students in that community in general, can bring them into your organization and give them an opportunity to learn what your business does and what its priorities are. And they may decide that they want to work there in the future. You decide to offer them a position. And so you've brought someone in to the company on a permanent basis based on opening that door for them. So I think it's important to start where you are and find where people of color gather in your community and go there and meet them, including by offering something of value like a partnership in an event. In a broader sense, recruitment can come from outside of that community. A lot of companies do national recruitment where they go to college campuses or job fairs nationally to give people internships or sort of encourage them to apply for positions in the organization. And that's also another way to, again, do some outreach to groups of people of color, letting them know about the opportunity and encouraging them to pursue it. And I don't think it involves doing that to the exclusion of any other marketing efforts. It should be done as part of all of the marketing efforts. And frankly, part of the problem is that people of color don't necessarily know about these opportunities, and B, they're not encouraged to pursue them. They don't hear someone say, I think you ought to do this or give it a try. And if you can be the person that says that, sometimes that's the beginning of a relationship.
Excellent. And I have a question here from Brandon in the audience. He wants to know about HR. He asked, in-house human resources department versus outsourced human resources department. Can you discuss the pros and cons of either? And then specifically when it comes to reporting issues of race or institutional racism.
Certainly. So I know that a lot of small businesses will outsource HR functions because they just don't have the capacity in terms of staff or finances to handle these functions themselves. And I think it's important to be thoughtful about the organization that you choose to do the outsourcing and to ask some really important questions. So a lot of companies that do HR outsourcing can handle payroll, recruitment, and health insurance, all of the basic protections or options offered to employees. But it's also important to understand how they handle complaints of discrimination, if they have that particular office or function at all, and if they do, to try to embed at least one member of their staff into your organization so that they are a point person who knows about what's happening in the company when a complaint is received. Because generally, once you outsource an HR function, you still are responsible for complying with applicable law, either by the client leasing agreement that you sign or under the case law governing various statutes. So, for example, the Fair Labor Standards Act could apply to a client leasing an HR outsourcing company and to the actual company, because either of them could be described as employers of that plaintiff.
Thanks again. And I want to move on from a question that we got that was previously submitted. And like I was saying, just looking at the comments here, you're getting a ton of comments of just very supportive of the information that you're getting, and also seconding all the information as well. But I do have a question here that's about something that's been in the news. Now, many businesses, and the examples they give are like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, decided to make changes to the brand imagery in response to claims of racism. Do you have any recommendations on how to recognize racial insensitivity in branding and take appropriate corrective action if necessary?
Sure. So I think, within the organization, there should be an interest in having people in leadership that have some background in understanding race and diversity in America, whose eyes can look out for these kinds of issues in terms of branding and how the organization is perceived in the community. And those people can be the voice internally that suggests a change in a name or a way the company markets itself. I also think that to the extent the organization does decide to change its name or modify it, it's important to do two things. The first is to figure out a way to market and explain to the public why the name has been changed. To explain, for example, to take Uncle Ben, to explain, what Uncle Ben represented, why the label Uncle Ben was first given to the product, and how the image has changed over time, or what the problem is with the image, so people know and hear about why it's being done instead of having it happen all of a sudden. And that can be done with a short film on YouTube or social media or some other marketing platform. The second is, I think it's a great idea to involve customers in the process. So if you're trying to figure out what the new name should be, have a national contest that allows customers to submit their own name of what it should be. Products and brands that do a great job of maintaining loyalty to customers generally have a special relationship with that customer. That customer will buy Uncle Ben's rice regardless of what other products they have. They have special memories associated with Uncle Ben's rice. They love that product, and they have specific stories they can tell you about it. The same as we all do. I'm sure everybody can think of a product that they love that they have their own relationship with. And so you can pick a name that actually resonates with people's own experience of the product. And there's so many options out there.
Thanks again, Jaden. I just want to fit in one final question because I do think it's important, and I do want to give a special shout out to Rhonda in the audience. She's been very active in the comments, so thank you for that. Now, what steps can be taken to keep racially charged debates and discussions away from the workplace, specifically topics that saturate the news, like politics, monuments, riots? How can we try to keep those to a minimum in the workplace?
Well, I guess I would question the premise of the idea of keeping it at a minimum, because you're not really going to be able to contain employees' interest in discussing or engaging with it. I do think all of those traditional efforts around diversity and anti-harassment training are useful in helping people know what the limits and boundaries are as far as what they can and cannot say about their opinion or belief. So I wouldn't try to discourage it or keep it out. And to go back to the theme of this presentation, figure out a way to use it creatively and go on the outside itself. One great way to keep it out is to deal with it outside of the organization. So, for example, there are lots of protests around monuments in Confederate monuments in various towns or cities. Perhaps it would be useful to work with an organization that wants to erect a monument for an event that's important in African American history or the history of a group of people of color, and get employees or allow employees to get involved in that work of helping to plan or create the monument, or have someone come in to talk about why they support Confederate monuments being up. And many people have intelligent arguments that they can use to explain why it's important to them, so that people can understand from an emotional standpoint why this person has this belief. Because for some people, it is just unfathomable. They can't explain why someone would believe this, but the workplace can bring someone in to talk about it, as long as that person can do it respectfully and intelligently.
All right, thank you so much, Jade, and we really appreciate your suggestions today, but unfortunately we have run out of time, so all unanswered questions will be forwarded to Jade via email. His responses will be sent to all attendees in the next coming days, and thanks to everyone who submitted questions and comments about today's topic. They're much appreciated, and also thanks to Jade for taking the time to answer them.
We enjoy hosting webinars for our valued customers, and as such would really appreciate your feedback. Please stick around a couple of minutes as a brief survey will open up for you to rate what you saw and heard today. We hope you found this information useful in understanding institutional racism and social injustice and what businesses can do to help. Thanks again to Jade, our guest panelist. We look forward to continuing to work with Jade on future presentations. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, we invite you to view past webinars on demand at the link provided on the screen. To all of our attendees, thank you for choosing Personnel Concepts as your provider of workplace compliance solutions. Thank you for attending our presentation. This concludes today's webinar. Have a good afternoon, everyone.